A homeless man came to the wedding, but when he took the microphone, something incredible happened. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think is going to happen, and let's see if you can guess right. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. The sun shone brightly on the elegant wedding venue as guests arrived in their finest attire, smiles reflecting the joy of the occasion. Among the sea of impeccably dressed attendees, a man stood out. His clothes were worn, his shoes tattered, and his face weathered from the elements. People whispered as he made his way quietly to the back of the crowd. No one knew who he was, but his presence caused a ripple of discomfort. Despite the stares, he remained calm, his gaze fixed on the couple standing at the altar. He wasn't here for the food or the celebration. No, his purpose seemed deeper, though no one could guess what it was. As the ceremony began, the whispers faded, and attention shifted to the bride and groom. Julia, a radiant beauty in white, stood holding hands with Thomas, her soon-to-be husband. Their love story was the stuff of fairy tales, and today was meant to be their perfect day. But something about the man in the back gnawed at Thomas. He had never seen him before, yet there was something oddly familiar about the way he stood, as though this stranger had witnessed something important in his life. Julia seemed unaware, her smile glowing brighter as the priest continued the ceremony. After the vows were exchanged, the couple was showered with applause, and the guests moved to the reception area. The homeless man remained distant, watching everything from afar, his expression unreadable. As the evening progressed, guests mingled and danced, enjoying the festive atmosphere. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the man's presence was significant. What could he possibly want? But before he could dwell on it too much, a voice interrupted the crowd's laughter and chatter. "Excuse me," the homeless man spoke, stepping forward, holding the microphone. His voice was soft but carried through the room, silencing the crowd. All eyes turned to him. Some gasped, while others exchanged confused glances. What could he possibly have to say? There was tension in the air, and Thomas's heart raced. Whatever this man was about to reveal, he knew it would change everything. As the microphone crackled to life in the homeless man's hands, an eerie stillness swept across the room. The guests stood frozen, their curiosity piqued but overshadowed by a growing unease. Thomas clenched Julia's hand, feeling the pulse of her heartbeat echo his own. The man's eyes scanned the room, pausing for a moment on the bride and groom, before he began to speak. "I know this isn't the time for speeches from strangers," he started, his voice steady yet carrying the weight of years. "But what I have to say cannot wait." The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. The man's appearance was in stark contrast to the elegance surrounding him, but there was something about his presence, something magnetic, that made it impossible to look away. "Many of you don't know me, and that's fine," he continued. "But some of you may remember me, especially you, Thomas." At that, a collective murmur spread through the crowd. Thomas's brow furrowed as he strained to recognize the man. There was a faint memory, blurred by time and circumstance, but he couldn't quite place him. Julia glanced at Thomas, her eyes wide with confusion. "Do you know him?" she whispered. Thomas shook his head slightly, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "I'm not sure, but there's something familiar." The homeless man caught Thomas's reaction and gave a small, knowing nod. "You don't remember, do you? It's been years, but I was there on a day that changed your life. You were just a boy, but I was there." The man's words sent a chill down Thomas's spine, his mind racing to make sense of what he was hearing. The room was thick with anticipation as the man took a breath and continued. "I'm not here to disrupt your happiness, Thomas. I'm here because I've carried a secret for far too long. A secret that belongs to you." At this, the crowd gasped. Thomas's face went pale, his hands trembling slightly as he squeezed Julia's hand. The mystery surrounding this man deepened, and with it came the sinking realization that whatever he was about to say would shake the very foundation of Thomas's life. And then, with a calm but powerful voice, the man uttered words that no one expected. "Thomas, I knew your father." The weight of the man's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The room was eerily silent, as if time itself had frozen. Thomas felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, The shock of hearing someone mention his father after so many years stirring up long-buried emotions. "You knew my father?" Thomas's voice cracked, disbelief etched in every word. His father had passed away when Thomas was just a teenager, leaving behind a void that no one had been able to fill. The man nodded, his eyes reflecting a sorrow that seemed to span decades. "I was there the night everything changed for him," the man began, his voice softening as if he were speaking of something sacred. "He wasn't always the man you remember. There were struggles, sacrifices, and a lot of pain he kept hidden from the world. But I saw it, all of it." The guests exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of this strange revelation. Julia tightened her grip on Thomas's hand, trying to anchor him as he faced this unexpected storm. "Why didn't I ever hear about you?" Thomas asked, his voice more steady now but filled with confusion. The man's face softened with a sad smile. "Because your father wanted to protect you from the truth. He built a life for you, one where you didn't have to see the darkness he once lived in. But I was a part of that world. I was the one he trusted when things got rough. We were friends, but more than that, we were brothers in survival." Thomas's breath hitched as a wave of memories came flooding back. Late nights where his father would sit in silence, staring into the distance as if haunted by something he could never share. "He never spoke of you," Thomas whispered, more to himself than to the man. The man looked down, his expression unreadable. "He was ashamed," he said quietly. "Ashamed of where he came from, and of the things he had to do to survive. But I'm not here to bring shame to his name. I'm here because I made him a promise before he died." At this, Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. "What promise?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The man took a deep breath and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "I promised him that one day, I would find you and tell you the truth. The truth about your father's past and the legacy he left behind. A legacy that is now yours to carry." The tension in the room was palpable as Thomas struggled to process the man's words. A legacy? His father had never mentioned anything remotely resembling a hidden past or future burden. Thomas had always believed that his father's story had ended in a simple life, one of love, hard work, and sacrifice. Yet, here stood this mysterious figure, claiming to know something deeper, something Thomas had never been privy to. "What legacy are you talking about?" Thomas finally asked, his voice shaky but resolute. He needed answers, and now he was ready to confront the truth. The man stepped forward, the crowd parting as he moved closer to Thomas and Julia. The guests watched in a mixture of awe and apprehension, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would change the lives of everyone in that room. "Your father wasn't just a man who worked hard to provide for his family," the man began. "He was part of something much bigger, something he kept hidden for years to protect you. Before he met your mother, before he settled down, he was involved in a world most people can't imagine. A world of power, influence, and wealth, but also danger." Thomas's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the man's words with the father he had known. The idea that his father had once been involved in something so grand, yet perilous, felt impossible to believe. "That can't be true," Thomas said, shaking his head. "My father was just an ordinary man. He worked at a factory, came home every night, and took care of us. That's all there was." The man's eyes softened as he looked at Thomas, understanding the disbelief in his voice. "I know this is hard to accept," he said gently, "but your father made many sacrifices to ensure you would never have to see the world he left behind. The truth is, he built a fortune that is now yours." The words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. A fortune? Thomas had grown up with no knowledge of such wealth. His family had lived modestly, never flaunting riches or living in excess. But now, this man was telling him that his father had amassed something vast and hidden it from everyone, even his own son. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking with the weight of it all. "Why keep this secret for so long?" The man sighed deeply, his expression heavy with understanding. "Because he didn't want you to be burdened by it. He wanted you to have the freedom to build your own life, without the shadows of his past looming over you. But now it's time you knew the truth." The room felt as if it had shrunk, the walls closing in as Thomas grappled with the revelation. Julia, standing by his side, looked equally stunned, her hand gripping his tighter for support. "What do I do now?" Thomas whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The man took another step forward, his face softening with a sense of duty fulfilled. "Now," he said, "you take your rightful place and decide how to carry this legacy forward. But there's one more thing you need to know. The fortune isn't just money or assets. It's tied to something far more dangerous, something your father was never able to escape." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the room seemed to close in around him. The weight of the revelation was almost too much to bear. A fortune tied to danger? His father had always been a figure of stability, a man who provided and protected. How could this man, standing in front of him with worn clothes and a sorrowful expression, know more about his father's life than he did? The guests, once festive and lively, now stood frozen in their spots, captivated by the unfolding drama. "I don't understand," Thomas muttered, running a hand through his hair. "What kind of danger are you talking about? My father never wanted anything like that for us." The man nodded solemnly, his gaze never leaving Thomas's. "Your father spent years building a life away from the shadows, but there were parts of his past he couldn't escape. Before you were born, he was involved with powerful people who demanded loyalty, secrecy, and sometimes even sacrifices. When he walked away from that world, they let him go, but they made it clear that he was never truly free." Thomas felt a wave of nausea. His father had lived with this looming threat for years, and yet he had never said a word. All those moments when his father had seemed distant, lost in thought, now they made sense. He had been carrying this weight, protecting his family from a danger they had never even known existed. "But why now?" Thomas asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Why bring this up on my wedding day of all days? Couldn't you have come before or after?" The man's face softened, and for the first time, Thomas saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Because they've found you," the man said quietly. "The people your father left behind, they've been watching, waiting. Your wedding is a public event, a signal to them that you've stepped into the life they once controlled. I came today because I needed to warn you. You've inherited more than just wealth, Thomas. You've inherited their expectations. They're going to come for you, and they won't be kind. They'll demand a price for your father's departure, a price that you may not be ready to pay." Thomas's mind spun as the full gravity of the situation settled in. His wedding day, meant to be the happiest day of his life, had turned into a nightmare. Julia, who had remained silent beside him, finally spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "What do we do?" she asked, looking from Thomas to the man. "How do we protect ourselves?" The homeless man's expression grew darker. "There's no easy answer, but you're not alone. Your father prepared for this day, even if he never told you. He left behind more than money, he left behind a plan. And I'm here to help you follow it." The room, once filled with joy and celebration, now seemed cloaked in uncertainty and fear. Thomas looked at Julia, her eyes filled with worry but also determination. He knew they couldn't run from this. Whatever his father had been part of, whatever danger now followed them, they would face it together. But the question lingered, heavy and unspoken. How far would they have to go to escape the shadows of his father's past? Thomas's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, swirling with fear, anger, and disbelief. How could his father have left him with such a legacy without so much as a warning? The man standing before him, ragged and unassuming, seemed to hold the answers, yet every word only deepened the mystery. "What do you mean, my father left a plan?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. He could feel Julia's steady presence beside him, her hand still gripping his tightly, as though to remind him that he wasn't alone in this. The man took a deep breath and reached into the inside of his worn coat, pulling out a small, weathered notebook. The cover was frayed at the edges, but the pages were neatly kept. "This," the man said, holding it out to Thomas, "is what your father left for you. He knew this day would come, though he prayed it never would. Everything you need to understand, everything he couldn't say, is written here." Thomas hesitated for a moment before taking the notebook, the weight of it in his hand feeling heavier than it should. He looked down at the cover, his heart pounding. In his father's familiar handwriting, the words "for Thomas" were scrawled across it. The room was still silent, Every guest's attention focused solely on the unfolding drama. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist, and the only reality was what was happening right here, right now. Thomas flipped open the notebook, the pages filled with his father's neat script, each line a glimpse into a life he had never known. "He wrote this for me?" Thomas whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The homeless man nodded. He spent years preparing it. Every decision he made, every choice to protect you, is in there. Your father knew what it would mean to leave that world, but he wanted you to be ready if it ever came for you. As Thomas read the first few lines, a deep sense of betrayal mixed with sorrow welled up inside him. His father had kept so much hidden, but there, in his own words, were the truths Thomas had never been told. "Thomas, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to protect you. I'm sorry. I wanted to shield you from this part of my life, but I can't anymore. There are people, powerful people, who will come for you, just as they came for me. But you are stronger than you think, and I've left you everything you need to fight back. Trust no one but those closest to you, and remember that not all battles are won with fists or money. Some are won with knowledge." Julia leaned closer to read over Thomas's shoulder, her brow furrowed in concern. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice soft but anxious. Thomas closed the notebook and looked at her, his expression grim. "It says we're in more danger than I ever could have imagined," he replied, his voice steady but filled with dread. He turned to the homeless man, his eyes searching for some semblance of hope. "How do I even begin to follow this plan? What's the first step?" The man's gaze was steady as he answered. "The first step is knowing who your enemies are. Your father left names, clues in that book. But it's more than just knowing. You'll need to act, and soon. These people, they don't wait. They strike when you least expect it. You need to be ready." The weight of the situation pressed down on Thomas's chest, but there was no turning back now. The legacy his father had left him was not one he could ignore, and the time had come for him to face it head-on. Whatever lay ahead, he would need to protect not only himself, but also the woman he loved. Thomas felt the pressure building with every second that passed. The notebook in his hands felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He stood in silence, gripping it tightly as his mind raced with possibilities and fears. Julia's concerned gaze never left him, but she knew better than to push. The homeless man, still standing at a respectful distance, seemed to sense the weight of the decision resting on Thomas's shoulders. "You have little time," the man said quietly, breaking the silence. "They've likely already started watching. You need to make your first move before they do." The words hit Thomas like a cold wind. His first move. He had never imagined himself in a position where strategic action was necessary. His life had always been simple: work, family, love. But now, with the shadow of his father's secret looming over him, everything had changed. "Where do I start?" Thomas asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He looked back down at the notebook, flipping through the pages filled with his father's handwriting. His father's voice seemed to echo from the past, guiding him toward a destiny Thomas had never chosen. "You need allies," the homeless man said, his tone firm. "Your father knew that no one can take on these people alone. There are names in that book, people your father trusted, people who helped him escape that world. You'll need to find them, convince them to help you. But be careful. Not everyone is who they seem, and some will betray you if it benefits them." The man's words were sobering, a reminder that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a game of trust and deception, where even those who seemed loyal could turn in an instant. Thomas nodded, his mind racing through the pages of the notebook. His father had left clues, names, and instructions, but it would be up to him to follow through. "Do you know where I can find these people?" Thomas asked, hoping the man might offer more than just warnings. The man shook his head. "I don't know where they are now, but I know that they'll come to you if you make the right moves. There are places, signals, things that will draw them out. Your father was good at keeping things hidden in plain sight." The realization that his father had planned all of this so meticulously made Thomas's chest tighten. He had never understood the depth of the man's struggles, or the lengths he had gone to in order to protect his family. But now it was his responsibility to take up that mantle. "What's the first step?" Thomas asked, his voice stronger now, more determined. The homeless man studied him for a moment before answering. The first step is to disappear. You need to make them think you're vulnerable, unprepared. Only then will they reveal themselves. But you can't do it alone. You'll need someone you can trust by your side. Julia, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her eyes locked on Thomas's. "I'm going with you," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "Whatever this is, we face it together." Thomas looked at her, his heart swelling with a mix of love and fear. He knew that involving her in this world meant putting her in danger, but he also knew that he couldn't face it without her. She was his anchor, his strength. With a nod, he agreed. "We face it together," he repeated, the resolve in his voice clear. The homeless man watched their exchange with a knowing look. "Good," he said. "You'll need each other for what's to come." He paused, his expression darkening. "But remember, Thomas, trust is a fragile thing. Even the ones closest to you can falter. Stay vigilant. You're entering a world where trust is a luxury few can afford." With that, the man turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Thomas and Julia standing in the midst of their wedding reception, now more confused yet determined than ever. As the door closed behind him, Thomas felt a new sense of urgency. The first move had been set in motion. Now they had to see it through. The evening air was thick with uncertainty as Thomas and Julia left the venue in silence. What was meant to be the happiest day of their lives had turned into something far darker, a path they hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. As they drove away, leaving behind the bewildered guests and unanswered questions, Thomas clutched the notebook tightly in his lap. Every page represented a hidden part of his father's life, a story that had been buried until now. Julia, sitting beside him, glanced over, her expression calm but her eyes filled with worry. "We need to find a place to lay low," Julia said softly, breaking the silence. "We can't go back to our apartment. If what that man said is true, they'll be watching." Thomas nodded, his mind still racing. His father had prepared him, even though he had never known it. "There's a cabin," Thomas replied, recalling a memory from his childhood. "My father used to take me there on weekends when I was a kid. It's isolated, deep in the woods, and no one knows about it. We can go there and figure out our next move." The drive to the cabin was long and quiet, the tension between them growing as they distanced themselves from the life they had known. Thomas kept glancing down at the notebook, reading bits and pieces of his father's cryptic instructions. Each entry seemed to unlock a new layer of mystery, but nothing provided a clear answer. Names were scribbled in the margins, locations hinted at, but there was no direct roadmap. The only thing that was clear was that his father had trusted very few people, and now Thomas would have to decide who to trust in return. When they finally arrived at the cabin, night had fallen, and the woods around them were cloaked in darkness. The old structure stood in the middle of a clearing, untouched by time. Thomas felt a wave of nostalgia as he stepped out of the car, memories of his father rushing back. "I never thought I'd come back here," he murmured, looking around. Julia stood beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. "This is a good place to think," she said quietly. "We can regroup and plan. Whatever comes next, we'll be ready." Inside, the cabin was as Thomas remembered it, simple, quiet, and safe. He placed the notebook on the table and lit a small lamp, casting a warm glow over the room. Julia sat down beside him, her eyes scanning the pages. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked, her voice low. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "My father left clues, but nothing is straightforward. He mentioned people, places, but I don't know who we can trust. We need to figure out who's on our side before we make any moves." As they pored over the notebook together, a pattern began to emerge. There were names of people Thomas didn't recognize, but alongside each name was a symbol, a small mark that seemed to categorize them. Some had a circle next to their name, while others had an X. "What do you think this means?" Julia asked, pointing to the marks. Thomas stared at the symbols, piecing it together slowly. "The ones with circles," he said slowly, "must be the people my father trusted. The XS, they might be the ones he feared." Julia's eyes widened. "Then these are the people we need to find," she said, tracing her finger over the circled names. "They're the ones who can help us." Thomas nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since this nightmare had begun. But as his eyes scanned the list, his gaze stopped on a familiar name. His breath caught in his throat. "This can't be," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Julia looked at him, alarmed. "What is it? What's wrong?" Thomas stared at the name, the shock settling in. It was a name he hadn't expected to see. A name tied to someone close to him, someone he had trusted his entire life. And next to it, there was an X. Thomas's heart raced as he stared at the name, the X next to it like a scar on the page. He could barely comprehend it. The name belonged to someone he had known his entire life, someone he had considered family. How could this person have been part of the danger his father had warned about? He felt the world tilt under his feet as the truth began to sink in. "This can't be right," Thomas muttered, his voice trembling. Julia leaned closer, her eyes scanning the notebook. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "It's Mark," he whispered. "My father's oldest friend. He practically raised me after my dad died. I trusted him more than anyone." Julia's face paled as she realized the magnitude of the revelation. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice soft. Thomas nodded, his hands shaking as he traced the X with his finger. "I don't understand," he said, the disbelief clear in his voice. "Why would my father mark him as dangerous?" Julia's hand rested gently on his arm, offering silent support. "Maybe there's more to Mark than you know," she suggested. "We need to be careful. If your father didn't trust him, there must be a reason." Thomas's mind raced back to his childhood, to the moments he had spent with Mark. He had always been there, a comforting presence after his father's death, a mentor, a friend. But now, everything he thought he knew was being called into question. "I need to confront him," Thomas said suddenly, standing up from the table. "I need to find out the truth." Julia's eyes widened. "Thomas, wait," she urged. "We don't know what we're dealing with yet. If Mark is involved in this, whatever your father was protecting you from, we need to be cautious." But Thomas was already pacing the room, his mind locked on the idea of confronting the man he had trusted for so long. "I can't just sit here," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "If Mark is part of this, I need to know why. I need to know what he's hiding." Julia stood up, stepping in front of him, her eyes pleading. "We need a plan," she insisted. "If we go to him without knowing what we're up against, we could be walking straight into danger. Your father left you this notebook for a reason. He wanted you to be prepared, not impulsive." Thomas stopped, her words hitting him like a wall of reason. She was right. Charging in without a plan would only make things worse. His father had warned him that this was a world of trust and betrayal, and if Mark was part of it, they couldn't afford to make a mistake. Taking a deep breath, Thomas nodded. "You're right," he admitted. "We can't rush into this. But I need answers, Julia. I need to know why my father didn't trust him." Julia softened, her hand reaching out to gently touch his cheek. "We'll get those answers," she promised. "But we need to be smart about it. Let's start by gathering more information. Maybe there's something in the notebook that will give us a clue about Mark's involvement. If he's dangerous, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Thomas reluctantly agreed, his body still tense with the need for action. They returned to the notebook, poring over the entries once more. Each page seemed to hold pieces of the puzzle, but none of it added up. Then, near the back of the notebook, they found something, a page with a list of addresses, one of which was circled and marked with a date. The date was only a week from now. "What's this?" Julia asked, pointing to the circled address. Thomas leaned in closer, studying the entry. "I don't know," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But it looks like it's something my father wanted me to find. Maybe it's where we'll get our answers." Julia nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Then that's where we start," she said firmly. "We'll go there, but we'll be prepared this time. No surprises." Thomas agreed, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. They were no longer running. They were taking control of the situation. But as they prepared to leave for the address, a nagging question lingered in Thomas's mind. If Mark truly was part of the conspiracy, how far did the betrayal go? And more importantly, Could he still trust the man who had been like a second father to him? The morning was cool and still as Thomas and Julia drove toward the address from the notebook. The tension in the car was palpable, each mile bringing them closer to answers, but also deeper into a mystery neither had anticipated. The address was on the outskirts of town, far away from prying eyes and familiar faces. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest since discovering Mark's name in the notebook, marked with an X. Julia sat beside him, her gaze focused on the road, though her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. As they approached the location, a nondescript warehouse came into view. The structure was old, its metal frame rusted and worn by years of neglect. It didn't look like much, but Thomas knew better than to trust appearances. "This is it," he muttered, pulling the car to a stop a short distance away. The two sat in silence for a moment, staring at the building that held the potential to change everything. "Are you ready?" Julia asked softly, her hand resting on his. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure if anyone could be truly ready for what they might find. They approached the warehouse cautiously, the silence of the surroundings amplifying every step. Thomas's heart raced as they reached the door, his hand hesitating on the handle. "If something goes wrong, we leave immediately," Julia whispered, her voice firm but gentle. Thomas glanced at her, thankful for her calm presence. "Agreed," he said, before pulling the door open. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp metal. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing off the concrete floors. In the center of the warehouse was a table, and sitting at that table, to Thomas's shock, was Mark. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. Thomas's heart sank as he met the eyes of the man who had been like a second father to him. "Thomas," Mark said, his voice steady, but with an edge of something Thomas couldn't place. "I didn't expect to see you here." Julia stiffened beside him, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't expect him because you thought your secret was safe," she said coldly. Mark's face darkened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he motioned for them to sit. "There are things you don't understand," he said, his tone calm but guarded. "Your father, he kept many things from you, not out of malice, but to protect you. And I've been doing the same." Thomas felt a wave of anger rise within him. "Protect me?" he snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "By lying to me? By hiding your connection to the people who are now threatening my life?" Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he admitted. "Your father and we were part of something much bigger than either of us. When he walked away, I stayed behind to keep things under control, to make sure no one came after you. But now, it seems everything is unraveling." Julia crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "So what now? Do we just trust you, after everything we've discovered?" Mark looked directly at Thomas, his eyes filled with something Thomas couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe, or something deeper. "You don't have to trust me," Mark said quietly. "But you need to understand that I've always had your best interests at heart. Your father's decision to leave the organization put you in danger, but I've been keeping you safe, even if you didn't know it." Thomas shook his head, struggling to reconcile the man he had trusted for so long with the shadowy figure his father had warned him about. "Why didn't my father tell me any of this?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "Because he wanted to give you a normal life," Mark replied. "He wanted you to have a future free from the burdens of his past. But now that they've found you, there's no running from it anymore." Julia's jaw clenched. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. Mark hesitated, glancing between the two of them before speaking. "There's a way out," he said. "A way to end this for good. But it's dangerous, and it'll require you to trust me one last time." Thomas stared at Mark, the man who had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. Trust was fragile now, hanging by a thread, but Thomas knew that without a plan, they were lost. "What's the plan?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but determined. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves could hear. "We have to confront the people who are after you, but we won't go in blind. There's a place, a meeting. They don't know you've discovered them yet. We'll use that to our advantage." The room fell silent as Thomas and Julia processed the gravity of what Mark was proposing. It was risky, but it seemed like the only way forward. Thomas nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. "Fine," he said. "We'll do it. But if you betray me, Mark, I swear this will end badly for all of us." Mark met his gaze without flinching. "I won't betray you, Thomas. Not now. Not ever." The tension in the car was palpable as they drove toward the meeting place Mark had mentioned. It was late, the streets eerily empty, and the silence between Thomas, Julia, and Mark felt like the calm before a storm. Thomas's mind raced with the weight of the decision he had made. Trusting Mark again after discovering his involvement felt like a gamble, one he wasn't sure he could afford to lose. Beside him, Julia sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, though her fingers nervously twisted in her lap. She had agreed to follow this path, but Thomas could sense her anxiety beneath the surface. Mark, sitting in the back seat, broke the silence. "When we get there, let me do the talking," he said, his voice steady but low. "These people know me, but they don't know you. They'll be suspicious, but if we play this right, we can get what we need." Thomas clenched the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "And what exactly are we getting?" he asked, his tone laced with tension. Mark's gaze was focused on the road, his face a mask of control. "Information," he replied. "There's a leader, someone higher up in the organization. If we can get to him, we can negotiate. He's the key to getting them off your back." Thomas exchanged a glance with Julia, who looked equally skeptical. "Negotiate?" she asked. "What makes you think they'll even consider negotiating?" Mark's face hardened. "Because they want something your father had," he said simply. "Something they've been after for years. I've kept them at bay, but now that your father's gone, they're more desperate than ever. If we can offer them what they want, there's a chance we can walk away from this." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. Thomas had no idea what his father could have possessed that would hold so much value, but he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. "And if we can't?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Mark's silence was answer enough. They pulled up to the meeting place, a dark, unmarked building tucked away in an industrial part of town. The area was deserted, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic. Thomas's heart pounded as they stepped out of the car, the reality of the danger they were about to face settling in. Mark led the way, his posture confident but tense, while Thomas and Julia followed closely behind. The entrance to the building was guarded by two men, their expressions cold and unreadable. Mark approached them calmly, exchanging a few quiet words before they stepped aside, allowing the group to enter. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with a long table at the center and several figures seated around it. Thomas felt a wave of unease as the door closed behind them, sealing them inside this tense and shadowy world. The men at the table turned their eyes toward them, sizing them up with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Mark stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "I've brought someone who needs to be heard," he announced, nodding toward Thomas. "He's the son of the man you've been looking for." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over the group. Thomas felt all eyes on him, a pressure that made his pulse quicken. One of the men, an older figure with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "So," he said slowly, his voice low and dangerous, "you're the son of the man who walked away from us. The man who thought he could take what belonged to us and disappear." Thomas swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. "I don't know what my father took," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "But I'm not here to carry on his fight. I just want this to end." The man's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "Your father made promises," he said coldly. "He owed us, and we intend to collect." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, but before he could respond, Mark stepped in. "That's why we're here," he said smoothly. "We want to resolve this peacefully. If there's something you need, let's discuss terms." The room was silent for a long moment, tension building as the men at the table exchanged glances. Finally, the older man leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Terms," he echoed, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think this is a negotiation?" His eyes flicked to Thomas, cold and calculating. "Your father took something valuable from us. Something irreplaceable. You think you can walk in here, unscathed, and simply offer to talk?" Thomas's chest tightened, the reality of the situation hitting him hard. This wasn't going to end with words. He had stepped into a world far more dangerous than he had imagined. The older man stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "You have one chance, boy," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Give us what we're owed, or you'll never leave this room." Thomas's mind raced. He had no idea what his father had taken, no idea what these men wanted. But he knew one thing for certain. They were in far deeper than they could have ever prepared for. And now they were running out of time. If you like this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you have a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and touching moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.